Hello. So today I'm going to talk about another book I have been reading, Developments in French Politics. This book is edited by multiple authors, including Helen Drake, Alistair Cole, Sophie Meunier, Vincent Tiberj, and each chapter is, just like the other book, authored by multiple or other authors in general. So, same thing, I'm going to talk about a chapter I've been reading, go into some analysis that goes into further detail on the topic. So, reading chapter 2, this chapter goes into the French presidency and its evolution over time. So, the French presidency has a multitude of powers, including formal ones over the prime minister and government. It has connections with the intermediary bodies like local powers and organized capital. It manages contact with public opinion, and it has a role as a responder and unifier in moments of crises especially. So prior to the current president, Emmanuel Macron, the presidency has been becoming a growingly distrusted position, and Macron early on has already lost support since his first term, and it's only continued since. So since Nicolas Sarkozy, former president from 2007 to 2012, the French presidents have tried to be transformative figures, including with Sarkozy from an increase in presidential power, his successor, François Hollande, in trying to normalize the role following Sarkozy, and then his successor, Emmanuel Macron, in acting as a disruptor of the traditional left-right politics. But they all seem to be lacking the charisma that most transformative figures have, which is even interesting for someone like Emmanuel Macron, who seems most likely to have been this transformative figure, but he lacks the transactional relationship with the people, as he appears very distant. So the current republic is known as the Fifth Republic, and the Fifth Republic's constitution outlined that the president's power to nominate and remove prime ministers, who as a figure is in charge of government, and the president chairs the Council of Ministers, which chairs the body over the prime minister and the parliament, and the president also has the power to dissolve government. So the presidency used to be elected every 7 years, and parliament was elected every 5 years. It still is. But the president depended on parliament to support his government. Now I'm going to use the word his because there have only been male presidents. So the issues of cohabitation erupted when opposing parliaments shared power with the president. And this came up in the 80s and 90s especially. So President Jacques Chirac changed the election of the president to be every 5 years and to align with the parliamentary elections for better policy alignment for the president's favor. So French history plays a major part in the president as a figure to unite the nation, especially in foreign policy. So this dates back to Charles de Gaulle and is something that all presidents have continued to follow. So the chapter then goes into the predecessor, François Hollande, and eventually into Macron's current presidency. Now, this book was published in 2021, so it only goes into about the time of Macron's COVID response. So François Hollande had poor control over his socialist and other left-wing parties when he was in power, which weakened his support and just gave him a very unstable government. So Hollande ran on a goal to restore a parliamentary vision of democracy that under Sarkozy had instead strengthened the president's power over parliament. So Hollande campaigned himself as the so-called normal candidate who countered Sarkozy's flamboyant use of the position. So this included keeping the president's private life from the public domain. But this proved difficult for Hollande with his relationship with his former partner Valérie Trierweiler, and in his lack of discretion with journalists that called into question Hollande's inappropriate use of the power of the French presidency. So normalcy was also just not what France endured at this time, as this was 2012 to 2017 was in the aftermath of financial crises. The multiple attacks that also including terrorism during the 2010s really marked this era. So Hollande did bring a sense of normalcy after the attacks, and he acted as a united figure in mass rallies, especially in 2015, to defend the Republic after the magazine publication Charlie Hebdo was attacked. And by the end of 2015, he actually had some of the best polling that he had before. So Hollande was also known as a war leader at this time. So he had many interventions in Africa, his strikes in Syria and Iraq. He successfully managed the COP21 conference in Paris, and his dealing with the fragile EU relations, including the risk of Greece almost leaving the EU in 2015. But perceptions of poor policy record and the lack of coordination with the executive and his Socialist Party really stood out, and he decided in 2017 to not run for the French presidency again. However, his presidency made some noteworthy successes, including the economic liberalization that made France more competitive than before, the legalization of gay marriage, and in his national unity after the terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015, it showed this excellent sense of leadership in the moments of crises. So, Macron seemed to have won his 2017 election from a luck from having no mainstream or non-radical candidate for him to compete with in the second round of voting. He also had an ability from his comparatively competent image in the media compared to Marine Le Pen and the in the opposing party from the far right, and his campaign tactics, including the maneuver over social media, really helped him win. So, Macron was perceived as a risk taker for giving up his position in Hollande's administration before for a risky presidential run that, of course, paid off. So Macron had a strong mandate from 2017, from his 2017 wins, including in a parliament being majorly on his side, which created almost this neo-Gaullist revival of presidential power in the Fifth Republic. So he started his presidency strengthening the role in his institution of technocratic-like aspects of governance, including appointing roles on profession and sidestepping the tradition of partisanship for the sake of supporting the president, and essentially in the sake of having effective governance, it seems. So Macron theorized the notion of being a Jupiterian president, which was this notion intended to ensure that the president have high powers over the republic. Now, this was something he pointed out as where Hollande was wrong in rejecting during his presidency. But this claim that Macron had used to describe essentially himself as a way of eventually made him seem distant from the French people, as many claim for him to be calling himself as the Jupiter of presidents. So there was also early on attempted labor reforms that Macron did in the deregulation program to encourage business investment and to reduce public expenditures. So Macron tried to position the EU as a body that would help France, as linking France to have endogenous stake in the EU for French domestic transformation. Macron made it an effort to not govern with civil society, as he saw it as basically a blockage to effective national governance. And it proved itself not a popular concept early on, and even with his 2022 Renaissance Party losses, his 2023 pension reforms, and the protests that followed, and even his COVID-19 pandemic responses, he has kept intact this vertical style of governance and not trying to work with civil society too much. So a 2018 scandal where one of his close political adversaries roughed up some protesters showed cracks in this type of leadership, as many began to view his administration and administrative style as an exclusive inner circle, unwilling to work with the political actors outside of their circle. So Macron made strategic private and public life distinctions as a way of promoting Macronism, including in his attempts to give his wife Brigitte a First Lady type of role that had been rejected as an overreach of his presidential power. So Macron's embrace of breaking norms, being married to a woman much older than him, using English, especially business English, when working in politics, and just his youth as a relatively young president in a global leadership of many elderly presidents, this is something that he has capitalized on as well. So Macron made an effort to not put himself in the public spotlight early on, but eventually he had to deal with the issues of government conflict, the yellow vest protests, and then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, Macron isn't really known as a negotiating leader. Examples of parties would coming together to negotiate more how to implement and not so much co-produce legislation are very common and remain common today. And this has been instead Macron has utilized more of a big bang policies that rather than attempt to compromise and just bring out big legislation instead. So Macron's style of disruption seems to be the authors say that Macron's style of disruption lies in this revolutionary aspect of governance and not necessarily being concerned with the end result, but being also concerned with how to even get to this result. So asking the question of why rather than the how only. Asking the why rather than how. And his concern with the operating system, we can call it, seems to disregard the nuances of politics, of the partisanship we know it to be, and lacks a clear project that most presidents have, actually. So Macron has opted for a political revival in the form of promoting a proportional representation system, but there hasn't actually been any actual legislation on this to this date. So another thing the authors point out is that the vestiges of the myth of the revered leaders lives on in France right now, as even the unpopular figures like Macron continue to draw public criticism. And this shows a sense of continued glorification of central leadership in France, regardless of how liked or unliked the president is. So the presidency is becoming almost a threatened institution, it seems, as proponents of the Sixth Republic exist on virtually both sides of the political aisle, and the concentration of presidential power is proving itself most concerning for the far left. So there is this recurrent theme of returning to normalcy. We saw in Hollande's 2012 campaign and even in Joe Biden's 2020 campaign, where both candidates positioned themselves as the antithesis to their disruptive predecessors. So many are drawn to these concepts of conserving the states in the midst of too much change, as it is a human affinity towards something like the elevation of power under Sarkozy or the drama that just surrounded Trump. What I think is worth considering here is that in both cases, the Normalcy project proved themselves insufficient, as voters did not feel that things were becoming normal once these figures won their respective elections. Instead, there was a continued disappointment expressed by the French, referring to Hollande as flambé, which is a dessert in France that is known for being very flimsy, and many called Hollande very flimsy and weak in that way. Or when Americans sarcastically would say, "Thanks, Biden," for national issues related to gas prices going up or inflation. So rather than go into whether these are accurate judgments of these two presidents, I see there is a correlation in how normal presidents don't prove themselves popular. Now, there are two issues that define whether a president and their term will be marked as normal, and that is in their character and in their times. So Hollande's character was undermined as normal when the scandals pertaining to his private life came under media scrutiny, and then the one related to his lack of discretion with a journalist. Now, the times while Hollande was president also proved themselves self-fulfilling to the rapidly transitioning nature of the world that has sped up in this age of globalization, which defined France in this. And at the times as Hollande was president, there was multiple violent incidents that occurred in Paris, including terrorist attacks in 2015, which defined France in this time as anything but normal. In this way, we can pin fault towards the so-called normal candidates for not taking into consideration these two issues. But the issue of normalcy also is something that voters might not always have a full understanding of. Well, the issue of normalcy also has fault in the electorate and the citizens, and in their perspective to whether normalcy is something that can even be achievable. So the character of the president is something voters might not always have a full understanding of, and thus it might not necessarily be the voters' fault for not foreseeing what becomes of the president over time, but the people's reaction to something like Hollande's private life with Valérie Trierweiler, or to Americans' reaction to Biden's age and health, something that was apparent in even his 2020 campaign, which proves how the reactions of the voters will determine what is considered normal, and is thus something that will be shaped through a subjective lens in describing what is normal in the end. In regards to the time as so-called normal candidates will promise to bring about, voters' appetite for normalcy sometimes becomes an issue of nostalgia, and it must be questioned whether voters are chasing an actual possibility based off of historical accuracy, or whether it is a disillusioned memory or perception of the past which does not imply accurate fulfillment. This opens the door towards subjective interpretation again from the citizenry, which makes answering this question not an easy one. And it calls into question the substance of the question of normalcy regarding the infiltration of inaccurate nostalgia for something like bringing normalcy back to the country. The issue of nostalgia might also be harnessed by candidates and can be placed the blame back on the candidates in the end, but also the voters are the ones who decide whether the nostalgic approach is effective. And voters in both France and outside of France have proven that this is actually an effective tool to get people to vote for you. So this open-ended term can have an array of interpretations from citizens, and as long as one citizen does not consider things normal, it doesn't seem like bringing normalcy will be a successful way of remaining popular once in power. So I find Macron's distance of the presidency and even his own character from civil society quite a remarkable development, as it is based off of this philosophy of the separation of political bodies in an effort to maintain the preeminence of the presidency in French politics and to have effective governance. It has two valid arguments worth delving into here. The first is that this is an abhorrent use of political power to surpass the democratic process of denying not only the opposition, but the citizenry as a whole in the governance of the French Republic. So Macron's distance shows a sense of superiority in his perceived skill over the French Republic that has come across as arrogant and Jupiterian in the not so grounded sense of that word. What's interesting about this notion is that it goes against the democratic principle we see as necessary in our leaders to connect with the people and at least portray themselves as working for the people's behalf. This goes out the window for Macron, as he purposefully has distanced himself from the public scrutiny, including through media coverage, and is a trait of his that he has pressed on even in the most dire circumstances, from his 2022 election losses to the COVID-19 pandemic response. Now, this has made the French presidency assumed notion as a unifier for the nation to be reevaluated to not necessarily be a man of the people, but more a man for the people, which is regardless of being popular amongst the people. Now, the second argument works in defense of this approach of Macron and sees Macron as working pragmatically as to the situation France is facing. This approach comes into defense of the disruptive status that Macron has come to be known for in French politics. So Macron's distance is perceived as a necessary balance away from the tradition of being too ingrained with partisanship, where instead a technocratic approach, which values merit over partisanship, is opted as the healthy practice to reach results. We see this as a continued method of governance with the recent years, as prime minister after prime minister have continued to be voted out of office in Macron's government, and Macron presses on in his position to not work entirely on political lines to have this stable government that he wants. This approach has validity in that Macron is valuing stability over the individual and partisan concerns that have shaped French politics and government, as well as made stalemate, which is not necessarily a good thing. And this is all while technically within the means of the democratic process. But by doing this, from Macron's position, the French presidency also becomes more strengthened in its powers as a way of fulfilling the technocratic approach of letting the so-called professionals do their job, as technocracies tend to imply. But in a field like democratic politics, professional is not based entirely on experience and knowledge, but on the democratic process, which doesn't consider these aspects as inherent. For many, Macron's power consolidation and distance from civil society's politics looks like a developing dictatorship underway, but for others, it looks like a strengthening of the French government and its legitimacy to surpass politics as usual. What I find also interesting in Macron's case, in that he is a disruptor, unlike other disruptors we tend to point to as international examples of disruptive politicians like Donald Trump or Javier Milei, While these two men are disruptive while being within the bracket of politics by aligning with the radical stances, both of these two men are more on the far right spectrum of their respective political orientations. Macron disrupts the game by throwing out the reliance on partisanship as a way of enacting stronger governance while not necessarily heeding a political agenda. For many, I know, who complain about government being too ineffective and too partisan, Macron's disruption would appear on paper as the perfect blend of disrupting the old system while evolving governance to go beyond partisanship. In a way, we can almost consider Macron's meritocratic approach the prescribed medicine to the issue of political polarization we see in development that doesn't play by the rules of being extremely to one end of the political spectrum, but instead prioritizes effective governance that's based on completing the agenda of the president. And even the fact that Macron is younger in a time when many feel that their leaders are too old, you would assume that Macron would be this ideal candidate and his ideas would be ideal for other countries. Of course, there lies the inherent issue of whether the president's agenda, as I mentioned earlier, is what the French public need/want. And then again, never will citizens be in complete consensus about all needs and wants in government. The Yellow Vest movements and the 2023 pension reforms protests have also shown that Macron's denial of politics' traditional power in governance does not bode well with French voters. But keep in mind that this backlash against Macron's governance remains on the basis of political stances, with the far right and the far left remaining on their opposite sides of the political spectrum. So this poses a question: does this in fact prove just how ineffective then, and this how effective partisanship is in government, that not even the opposition towards Macron's technocratic approach can even unify and create a real change, as he is still president 8 years on? That's for you to decide, but this French example of disruption is such a fascinating case regarding dissecting what it means to be a disruptor in government, and how that doesn't necessarily require the partisanship we associate in government, especially between left and right. But one note worth considering here is that the left and right of politics and the political parties have tended to be the result of democratic conflict. If Macron aims to surpass this, the optics of his technocratic form of governance could come off as surpassing not only partisanship, but also the democratic process of conflict and compromise. In this manner, effective government might not necessarily entail maintaining the democratic process for Macronism. So thank you for watching this. I will continue reading this while continuing with the UK politics book, but I will see you in the next video.